Very good. Thank you, Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. I wasn't here when sequestration was voted in August of 2011, but I tell you this, I wouldn't have voted for it. As the Chairman pointed out in his opening remarks, it was a disaster waiting to happen, and now we have less than 14 hours before the clock ticks down. When that vote was taken, I had just returned to work following my recovery from the wounds I received on January 8th, and I saw the Congress inflict a wound on this country that we thought we would heal by now. We haven't, and we have failed in our responsibility to do so. Instead, we have squandered, week after week, the time we had to deal with this problem long before we got to 13 hours, 47 minutes and 15 seconds before the sequester kicks in. Included in that delay and that time, we gave ourselves 2 months back on January 1st to come to grips with the problem, and we failed again. Instead, we have put on the floor time and time again motions to adjourn, going home. I'd love to go home, but I'd much rather be here working on this problem with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I voted against all of those adjournments because we should be here dealing with this issue. I grew up in a military family. I've worked for a long time with our men and women in uniform, with the civilians who work on bases and garrisons across my district. I work with private companies that are critical to our defense, our national defense. And we've absolutely squandered the time we could have taken to fix the problems that they're facing. There's a morale problem in our military as a result of this uncertainty. There's a morale problem and an uncertainty in the economy as a result of our inaction. Last Friday, I met with a group of representatives from my district, civilian employees of the Department of Defense, companies that provide for our national defense, firefighters, and others. And one of my constituents described what we did in a way that I think is very apt. He said, when Congress approved sequestration, it built a nuclear bomb which it never intended to explode. It designed a poison pill it never intended to have a swallow. But here we are, now 13 hours, 45 minutes, 21 seconds and counting, before the bomb goes off and the pill is ingested. It is simply unacceptable that we got to this irresponsible point. When I came here last June, I came not as a partisan, but prepared to work across the aisle with anyone who was willing to find common ground to resolve this and other critical issues, and I remain here ready to do so. My district is home to the Army garrison at Fort Huachuca in Cochise County, to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, and just across the line, I claim it as if it was our own, the Air National Guard fighter wing. These are vital elements in our national defense and in our local economy. And my question, Secretary, is for you in regard to the impact that sequestration and the continuing resolution have. You made some important points that really struck me. In your testimony, you said, for example, that every single piece of equipment used by our soldiers will be impacted if sequestration goes into effect. And as a result, equipment will not be modernized, timelines for delivery will be delayed, and costs will be overrun. It is clear to me, at least from your testimony, that sequestration will not only impact our forces in the next weeks and months, but will set them back for years. My question is, since it appears in a few short hours we'll be allowing sequestration to kick in, we'll likely see furloughs in our Army, we'll see losses in operability. How long, in your view, and how, in your view, will the Army recover from the $479 billion in cuts that you've already taken and the further cuts that will take effect in this fiscal year? Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much for the question. I think you're dead on correct in terms of the impacts
and that is my biggest fear. The problem is we are facing with a CR impact today. There's new programs we can't start, production rates that we're supposed to ramp up, which we cannot do. There's a program that's in development that we arbitrarily put a ceiling on, so it's going to impact and stretching out our programs and increasing the cost to the Army. On top of that, now we're having a sequestration which cuts uniformly. It's a buzzsaw cut across all the programs. So it's a double whammy on the impact of all of our programs. So how do we recover from that? You can only recover if you have a full understanding of the limitation of the cuts and what's going to happen next. If we had a budget and if we know exactly what's going to happen this year in future years, you can at least start to do the detailed planning. But the tremendous uncertainty that we're facing today is posing these challenges, because I can't tell, as my counterparts have already articulated, since each of our programs is being cut, we have to rework every single program. To understand the long-term impact, it's hard to judge without knowing what's going to happen to the future budgets. So I have some significant concerns, sir.
Well, I think it's well said. And, you know, when I was at Fort Huachuca a week ago tomorrow, I was talking to some local businesses. They're not involved in the defense industry, but very much affected by it. I talked to a woman who runs a car dealership, and she hasn't had an order for a car in almost a month. And why? Because people don't know if they're going to have a job or if their job is going to be cut by 20%. Let me just ask one quick question of you, Lieutenant General Davis. I appreciate your testimony. We have taken, I think, a very irresponsible approach to our fiscal crisis. And just as our constituents, my constituents, could not cut their budget by 10% without going into foreclosure if they cut their mortgage or having their car repossessed if they cut that, neither can companies and neither can our Department of Defense. So I want to ask you, General, how do you build 90% of an airplane? And how do you build 90%, in the case of the Navy, of a submarine? How do you make these decisions about which programs and assets to fund and which to leave behind? How will you determine the priorities given the situation we're facing, which hopefully still can be reversed in due course? But if it does not change, how do you make these decisions? What priorities will you be looking at from the Air Force perspective moving forward if nothing changes?
Yes, sir. I think it starts back where our Chief and Secretary have testified that there's some very key priorities within the United States Air Force, and it starts with modernization. We have fighters that are approaching 25 years old, trainers that are 40 years old, bombers that are in excess of 30 years old. So we've had to take what we have within our current modernization budget of roughly $35, $37 billion a year and try to figure out where those priorities. Our top three priority programs, the tanker, the bomber, the F-35, are about 15% of that budget. And it's clearly imperative that, again, back to if we're going to maintain the missions you've given the United States Air Force, that those have to be modernized. So that means that other programs of lower priority, if we're given the flexibility, we'll have to pay that 10% that will drop from those programs at some point. And it'll be very insidious as we go through this. As you take 10% out of the F-35 program, you lose a couple of airplanes this year, and then you lose a couple more next year. And then the challenge as we go through that program on the out years, when we ramp up production, it gets quite significant numbers. So it starts with the priorities the nation has given the Air Force. It starts with how the Chief and Secretary put those priorities into play within our budget, and then we go execute the programs to meet those, and we decide where we fill in that 10% and from what program it comes from. And that bottom 20 to 30% of our modernization budget will be the first casualties of those programs.
General, you just said something that I think is very important. You said given the flexibility, you will make decisions in a different way than you would without that flexibility. Hopefully the least we will do is give you flexibility, but what if it doesn't happen? What if you don't get the flexibility?
Sir, then if that's the case, and we've done this in many cases in the past, you take a very surgical cut to pieces of that program that will move to the next year. And then, as we often are asked to do, we tell the program managers, tell me how you're going to live with that. And the next year, we'll tell them the same thing, and we'll ask them the same question. So what this means is that these programs that already, as is mentioned, somewhat struggle, they struggle even more as you push that capability piece out a year or a year or a year, and that falls off. So you try to target the least important of those capabilities. You try to target, as you can, most of the inefficiencies and waste that may exist in the programs, because it does. But very often, after you do that once or twice, you're now cutting the capability you asked to have in that program to begin with. So we will do that and have to do that across the board, and that's where the utter inefficiency of the process really takes hold. And that's where a lot of the waste occurs, because when you're not given the flexibility to manage the budget you have against your priorities, it creates extreme inefficiencies and you lose capability quickly.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.